welcome to the special briefing on the EU's emissions trading system and the dramatic events that have been occurring around it at the European Parliament. So to recap briefly, what started was the European Parliament's Environment Committee agreed a package of reforms that was, somewhat more ambitious than the original Commission proposal. Then this package went to plenary, and a lot of amendments were suggested for it that lowered and watered down the ENVI Committee's proposal. And this led a lot of MEPs to vote against it and return it to the ENVI Committee. So this week they have a second chance to vote on the package. Some MEPs defended the rejected compromise, saying that it was good for the climate, but as you'll learn today, our analysis shows otherwise. It shows that the discarded deal was actually terrible news for the climate and the environment, and on other levels too. Some argue or have argued that this is the best that we can get in the current political climate, but what this overlooks is the rapidly warming climate. And this is reflected already around us in the unprecedented and early heat waves we've been suffering and witnessing here in Europe, but also in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh, and the terrible monsoon they're having there. So this raises a question about realpolitik. But if we focus just on realpolitik, we'll rapidly crash against the unforgiving rocks of scientific reality. We also must choose, which principles we follow. So there's a polluter pays principle, which is enshrined in EU law, but at the moment we're heading on a track of allowing the polluters to profit rather than to pay. So, as I said, MEPs have a final chance this week to match their haughty rhetoric on the climate and some of the historic decisions they made earlier, like the climate law and so on, and to rise to the challenges presented by this, historic moment and turning point, because we don't have any time to lose. This decade is vital for the climate and our future, our future prosperity and ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. So we have a wonderful and excellent expert panel lined up to speak on these issues and explain to you the ins and outs of the complex issues involved and questions raised by the EU's emissions trading system and how it fits into wider climate policy. So we've got Klaus Rohrig from Climate Action Network Europe, or CAN Europe. He is their EU Climate and Energy Policy Coordinator. We've got Agnese Ruggiero from Carbon Market Watch, my colleague here at Carbon Market Watch, who focuses on industrial decarbonization as well as the EU's emissions trading system and CBAM and other related issues. We've got Anna Gläser from Germanwatch, and she's the Senior Policy Advisor on carbon pricing. And we've got Domien Vangenechten, who's a Policy Advisor at E3G, and he focuses on EU industrial policy, industrial decarbonization, and carbon capture and storage. I'll hand over first to Klaus.
Yes, thank you very much, Khaled. And also thanks to Carbon Market Watch for organizing this briefing, and good morning, everyone. I will briefly share some slides with this section. So my name is Klaus Rohrig, and I work for Climate Action Network, or CAN Europe. We are a coalition of NGOs and civil society organizations across Europe fighting dangerous climate change. And I work in the policy team on climate legislation, and we work specifically on EU energy and climate laws in order to bring them in line with the Paris Agreement. And I will talk a bit first about the issue that also Khaled already referred to, the struggle for the overall ambition and also the role of the EU's carbon market in ensuring the EU's overall contribution to the Paris Agreement and its fight against the climate crisis. So as a first picture, of course, you all felt it probably, or many of you have felt it already this weekend, the very heat anomaly that we already experienced now in June. This, of course, is only one part of a very large pattern of the effects of climate change that we can already feel. Of course, not only in Europe, even worse outside of Europe. But already within Europe, we are very aware of the very detrimental impacts that the already increasing temperatures that we are seeing already have. And maybe just to refer to a few recent numbers, I mean, this year already the European Environmental Agency also looked again into evidence of the economic and also life costs of the climate crisis that has already hit Europe in the last 40 years. And they associated the extreme weather events such as heat waves and floods, which we see with higher and higher frequency under further increasing climate scenarios, already causing almost €500 billion in costs for the EU. And of course, this is part of the global picture in which we operate at the moment, and also in which, of course, the EU is now taking action, and also in which the revision of the EU's carbon market is taking place. And of course, this relates a bit to the overall targets that the EU has set. I mean, at the international level, of course, under the Paris Agreement with the other nations across the world, to commit to limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, above pre-industrial levels. We are already experiencing average temperature increase from by above 1 degree. So we are very close to actually overshooting and missing this target of the 1.5 degree increase. And of course, you're all very well aware of the repeated and continuous warnings also from the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, from the climate scientist communities, of course, echoed by NGOs and civil society worldwide, that if we are still serious about the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement, rapid and unprecedented action is necessary, and particularly action until the end of this decade, until 2030. And this is also why the current revisions under the Fit for 55 package that do have the time horizon for 2030 are so critically important to enable the EU to actually deliver also on its global objectives and its global commitments under the Paris Agreement. So as you probably also know, relatively recently, the EU has increased its commitment for 2030, so adopting an overall target of minus, or at least minus 55% net emission reductions by 2030. And the current revisions of energy and climate legislation that are part of the so-called Fit for 55 package are meant to then implement this target and to put it into action. And on the climate side, there are notably three pillars, of which the EU emissions trading system, or the EU carbon market, or short, the ETS, is a vital pillar. So we have the revision of the ETS carbon market dealing with emissions from the power sector, the industry sector, and aviation. And then the other legislations that are also under revision now are the effort sharing regulation that is dealing with all those emissions that are not covered by the EU carbon market, so notably from agriculture, transport, buildings, waste sectors, and then the so-called LULUCF regulation, or land use change and forestry legislation, regulation that deals with emission removals. So those three pillars together are kind of the instrument that in the end is putting into action the EU's international pledge for emission cuts by 2030, and therefore also its international pledge towards the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And there have been also vast, I mean, since the new target was adopted, vast assessments as well of checking whether this overall target of net 55% is actually in line with the 1.5 degree target. Is it fit for purpose itself? And probably also to no surprise of you, we NGOs have been very critical of this target, saying, of course, it says at least, so it should actually go well beyond 55, because if we look at 55 alone, this is not a fair contribution of the EU towards the 1.5 degree goal, especially keeping in mind also international principles of equity, but also keeping in mind the EU as a major historic emitter and a rich economy with the capacity to act. It should go, or it should do much more than the global average should do. So it should go well beyond net 55%. And as NGOs, we have a collective position that in order to be in line with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, the EU should overall achieve by 2030 emission reductions of at least 65%. This then also means that the current overhaul of the climate legislation is also an opportunity. It's a window for the EU to actually make sure to strengthen each file and the ambition of each file, so that the EU can actually overachieve and overshoot this 55% and get closer to a trajectory that can be considered more consistent with a fair contribution to the 1.5 degree goal of Paris. So this is also where the entire discussion and struggle that we have seen in the negotiations on the EU ETS, or the emissions trading system, is taking place. And now, of course, given that we are in a crucial week and also after the dramatic events in the European Parliament, we zoom a bit closer on that particular institution. The Parliament that has also historically always underlined its role or its reputation as a defender of the 1.5 degree target and a defender of citizens against the climate crisis. We have to now seriously ask ourselves, is this still true? Is the European Parliament still a champion for climate action or climate ambition? And when we look back into the recent past, we actually had a lot of strong declaratory statements. So in 2019, the European Parliament declared a state of climate and environmental emergency, asking for all legislation to be aligned with the 1.5 target. And then in 2020, it also voted on the EU climate law with a stronger position than the European Commission had, actually called to strengthen the overall climate target to 60%, so well beyond the net 55%. And you can find also more information on this in our briefing, Walk the Talk. So we call this also now the Walk the Talk moment for the European Parliament, especially the process on the climate files, and then particularly also the ETS votes. So if we saw them being a champion on the overall targets, this of course in turn also means that the Parliament should be instrumental in strengthening the ambition level of the implementing legislation. We actually didn't see that in the effort sharing regulation. The Parliament was not very strong there. It didn't vote to increase the ambition here. It didn't do it either for the LULUCF regulation. So that actually means the only vehicle to really substantially increase the EU's overall ambition is the ETS, is the European carbon market. And here we had these developments in the recent weeks and months, with actually a very positive development first in the Environment Committee, where the Environment Committee of the European Parliament in mid-May actually voted and adopted an increase, a substantial increase of the ambition of the ETS. But we saw this position falter when it came to the plenary votes in June, just a few weeks back. And I guess many of you have also seen the dramatic scenes during the votes. We actually saw then kind of a very strong block in the Conservatives groups voting against the more ambitious element of the ENVI report, and in the end also severely watering down the ambition of the ETS, which in turn then led to particularly the Social Democrats to in the end vote against the final report and reject the report. And this is why we are now seeing the report being retabled again in plenary this week. So the question now from our side is, did it work? Is it now a better deal that we will see on Wednesday? So is there now a second chance, and the European Parliament is actually taking that chance? So let's look a bit into this. So I'm sorry, there will be a few numbers, but maybe just as a quick explanation why we were very pleased with the outcome of the Environment Committee. We actually saw a strengthening of the parameters of the ETS that would have increased the overall ambition of the ETS towards a higher target, towards a 68% target. And in turn, what matters for the atmosphere and for the climate is, of course, the overall emission allowance, or the overall emissions that the atmosphere will see from now until the end of the periods. And those are usually expressed in cumulative emission reductions. And we actually could quantify those. So for the environment report outcome, we would have additional 731 million tons of emission reductions compared to what the Commission had proposed. So that is quite a significant increase. To have a picture, this is more than, for example, the annual emissions of Spain and Italy together. So looking at the options that were then on the table for plenary, this was by far the most consistent one with also the European Parliament's previous declaration and position to increase the overall ambition of the EU on climate. But this was then did not pass the plenary votes, and we actually had a watered down amendment that passed. And when we then look at the actual emission reductions that are associated with this plenary vote outcome, it is a huge, it's a huge difference. So basically, it would only increase or only improve the Commission's proposal by 18 megatons CO2 emission reductions. And even the new compromise that we now saw coming out of the negotiations last week, and that will now be tabled again for the mini plenary this week, is again just a very, very marginal increase in ambition compared to the really bad outcome of the plenary vote. So you see here that it will be, are we expecting maybe 24 megatons of additional emission reductions as this new compromise that is being put on the table. But this, of course, is a far cry from the emission reductions that the Environment Committee had put forward. And it's virtually also almost no difference to the overall emission reductions that the Commission has proposed. So in this case, the European Parliament definitely is failing on substantially strengthening the Commission proposal. It basically means that it is solely like repackaging what the Commission has put forward, maybe with different parameters, but the overall impact is very, very similar, and it's still a very significant watering down of the emission reductions that we had in the Environment Committee. So that this now also would lead to our call for MEPs this week. We, of course, still see the ambition level of the Environment Committee being put on the table, and we urge all MEPs to support this amendment of the outcome of the Environment Committee. This is the only one that is in line with the previous promise to increase the overall ambition of the EU by 2030. And they shouldn't just put lipstick on a pig, so they should just not repackage a bad deal. This still remains a bad deal, so no empty promises here. And at the same time, if we see that the European Parliament fails and is not taking a leadership on championing climate ambition, then it will also be up for EU environment ministers to step up. And as we are at the moment very much in need of an urgent and true climate champion here. I will leave it here, and I think there will be time for questions also later. Thanks.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you. That was very interesting. And I guess the main point we should all take home from that is that, you know, repackaging the same, the same deal does not make it a new deal, and that we need a truly new deal for the climate and the environment in order, to build a better future for everyone in Europe and the wider world. As Klaus was saying, we won't be taking questions at this moment. We'll take questions after all the speakers have presented their presentations. You'll notice, for those of you unfamiliar with Zoom, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, you can put your questions, type your questions into there, and we'll deal with those questions following the presentations. And some of the questions may also be dealt with in writing, but so use that for any questions you may have for the speakers, or general questions about the issues raised today. You can also share some thoughts, if you like, in the chat box. Now we'll hand over to Agnese, who will be speaking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and its relationship with the ETS, and why the European Parliament needs to be more ambitious on this front. Over to you, Agnese.
Thank you, Khaled, and good morning, everyone. Also, thanks from our side for all those that have come to listen to our press briefing. I think also I wanted to thank Klaus for the great overview that is provided on the general issue, of course, that where the reform of the emissions trading system and the proposal for the carbon border adjustment mechanism sort of fit in. I'd like to take this time to zoom in a little bit more on the problem that industrial emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions from energy intensive industries create and have on the impact that they have in Europe, and therefore why the reform of the emissions trading system and the implementation of a carbon border adjustment play a key role in the whole European Green Deal. I will share also a few slides to also visualize a little bit the numbers and the different scenarios that we'll discuss today. First of all, I would like to bring the debate in a way a bit back on why these systems have to be reformed, why this is important, and why now, and how much urgency there is in this process. And the problem is that when we look at industrial emissions, we see that there hasn't been virtually any reduction in emissions in the last decade. The industrial sectors, unlike, for example, the power sector, has basically seen no change in their emissions levels. And while the power sector's emissions have gone down already in 2018, were reduced by more than 20%. So this shows that a strong reform of the ETS is needed, and the carbon border adjustment can be a very good complementary tool if it provides, if it works in tandem with this, with the carbon market, and actually brings emissions reductions both in inside in our domestic production in the EU and also in our trade partners. The point is that these two can work and can be effectively only if implemented sort of in the carbon market, implementing the polluter pays principle. So actually reviewing this system so that it's implemented as a market where allowances are bought by companies, and so that the companies can internalize this cost and use this as price signal to invest in cleaner production processes. On the one hand. On the other hand, CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, would provide also a carbon price signal to the trade partners and a level playing field for European companies that would be on equal footing with their competitors outside Europe, and thereby reduce emissions in our domestic market and also encourage emissions reductions in our trade partners. This is the concept, this is the idea. And this is how it can work. Now, in July 2021, the European Commission proposed, they published their proposals both on the reform of the ETS and the introduction of CBAM, and already showed a lot less ambition and sort of backtracked on their initial claims, or actually statements, that the carbon border adjustment mechanism would replace the carbon leakage framework within the ETS, so the free allowances, the free pollution permits that are granted to industrial sectors, and instead suggested a implementation timeline of over 10 years with the free pollution permits that continue for another 15 years, largely because the phase out is only envisaged in 2035, with some revenues that from the carbon market can be raised by member states to be reinvested in climate action. So a lot less than what could be generated if all allowances were auctioned. A lot of free allowances still granted to energy intensive industries, and of an increased volume for industrial innovation through the Innovation Fund, but not as much as it could have been increased if all the allowances were auctioned. So once this file in the legislative process moved on to the European Parliament, the European Parliament can work to improve on the Commission proposal, and could have shown a lot more ambition, a lot more commitment to phasing out free pollution permits, to implementing the polluter pays principle, and implementing a strong CBAM. In the Environment Committee, this was to some extent achieved. At least the Commission proposal was improved. The reduction of free pollution permits was still progressive, but over 5 years instead of 10. So the full phase out by 2030 could have provided a better, stronger price signal, and increased the level of overall emission reduction in the ETS sectors, and reduced the total of free pollution permits, increased quite largely the size of the fund to finance industrial innovation, cleaner production processes. So the problem was that in the plenary vote, instead, the one that sort of was eventually rejected in the plenary in Strasbourg, beginning of June, this improvement that was achieved in the Environment Committee was again watered down. Had it passed, this vote would have been quite negative for the climate, and also for incentivizing reductions in industrial emissions. And here I have some comparison. For example, in the proposed reduction of free allowances, as you can see, the plenary vote would have almost still given to heavy industrial sectors 5 billion allowances. That here another graph that shows that this is still almost 5 billion of pollution permits given for free, that at roughly 80 euros per ton equals almost 400 billion of revenues that could be better reinvested, could be auctioned to member states and given to the Innovation Fund to support further climate action, including the industrial transition. What's more is that with this proposal and the way it was shaped, with a longer phase out, a weaker implementation of the CBAM, there is also repercussions on the auctioning revenues for member states with like I said, with the resources of the dedicated to industrial innovation. So in the end, this deal was rejected, as we know, and there has been in preparation for the vote that there is on Wednesday this week. The three major larger groups of the European Parliament had to sort of scramble together a new deal, because there is a new vote, and of course the center left, the Socialist and Democrat, rejected the plenary vote in Strasbourg, and so needed to find sort of a new compromise, something that could go through in this new upcoming vote. But the thing is, and that what we've been saying since we heard and understood the details of this new deal, is that it's not better at all compared to what was in the end rejected in the plenary vote. So this comes as a great disappointment in a way, because what it shows is that there is going to be, if it's voted in 2 days, this new proposal still hands out copious amounts of pollution permits for free. It's again roughly very, very close to what the plenary vote would have led to, but also very close to the Commission proposal. In fact, a bit more free pollution permits than the Commission's proposal. Here is another graph showing this. So again, almost 5 billion allowances that are not auctioned, that are given for free. And these are only numbers that look at the 2021-2030 timeline. And the new deal also will result in lower auctioning revenue and less funding for innovation. In fact, it is a worse deal than even the Commission's proposal. So the Parliament, with this potential agreement between the three main groups, is not suggesting anything better, and there is no improvement on the European Commission proposals. There is the groups like indeed S&D that had rejected this deal, and almost entirely based on the implementation phase and the timeline to implement CBAM, have then given in this the pressure of the right party, the European People's Party, and the Renew group to find a deal that in the end can be considered and was labeled as different and more ambitious than what was rejected in plenary, but in fact the numbers show that it isn't. And it is not, so it's not an improvement on what was voted down in plenary, and it's not an improvement on the European Commission's proposal. So the conclusion is that fortunately there are some groups that are still prepared to, they're still more ambitious and have retabled the amendments that were agreed in the Environment Committee. This week is another chance for the MEPs to be ambitious for the climate, to really enforce the polluter pays principle. And so as a conclusion, considering that what was voted in the Environment Committee was already an improvement, or was somewhat an improvement on the European Commission proposal, was certainly better than what was voted in plenary, and there is another chance for them to support this. So we really call on our MEPs, and to improve the Commission's proposal and to speed up the phase out of free pollution permits and stick with the timeline of the end of them by 2030 at the latest, and therefore also implement a strong and effective CBAM that starts being effective from our earlier date. And then indeed, as my colleague Klaus mentioned earlier as well, should they fail at this task, we also turn to the European Council and the environment ministers to be more ambitious for the climate. It's urgent and 2030 is coming quite soon. So thank you.
And thank you, Agnese, for this thorough and thoroughly fact-based analysis of the situation and the reality we are experiencing here. I guess the main thing to bear in mind here is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And all these freebies are being handed out willy-nilly to heavy industry. You know, it was climate and society that will be left to carry the tab and pay the bill on this. Basically, we'll have to collectively pay the bill in terms of the damage to climate of these free allowances. We'll have to pay the public health consequences of all the air pollution, you know, and many, many other costs, including the costs that we could have financed for innovation and adaptation and social solidarity. You know, all these costs that could have been borne through the sale of you know, the pollution permits will have to be carried by everyone but the industry that's causing it. So yeah, so it's a bit of a paradoxical situation there. But as Agnese pointed out, the CBAM can be a powerful tool and a weapon in the EU's arsenal if it's deployed correctly in a way that is complementary to the ETS and not as cross purposes to it. So now we'll hand over to Anna, who will give us a German perspective on these issues, namely CBAM and free allowances. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Anne Gläser. I'm a policy advisor for carbon pricing at Germanwatch, and Germanwatch is a German environment and development organization. I will keep my presentation rather brief so that you can ask us more specific questions afterwards. Yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, we can immediately jump to the second slide. Thanks. So I will just very quickly start with an overview over the German context, which is on my second slide. Well, as all of you know, we have a rather new government since the end of last year, and what is important to know is that in Germany the coalition treaty is quite a binding document. It's like a little bit different than in other countries. It's not like 100% binding, but it's the coalition treaty is always like the key document, and mostly it's like mostly being implemented. And the coalition treaty of the new German government is clearly stating support for the whole Fit for 55 package of the European Commission, which means that the German government is also supporting the CBAM as it was proposed by the European Commission. However, as most of you also know, the German economy is very much based on exports, or like the exporting industry plays a very significant role in the German economy, which is why there are widespread concerns about CBAM only covering imports. So yeah, in the proposal by the European Commission, export rebates are not provided for. So there would only be sort of a carbon leakage protection for concerning imports, and if there was a phase out or like a complete end of free allocation, the exporting sectors would only be sort of protected from carbon leakage to some limited extent. This means that in Germany, where the exporting industry plays such an important role, there's very strong opposition by the industry concerning an accelerated phase out of free allocation. And because of this opposition of the industry, the government is also, let's say, a little bit cautious. They are not opposed to the CBAM only covering imports or to like a phase out of free allocation, but compared to other member states, there is there's a much larger reservation concerning this, and in Germany, they're like most stakeholders see the very big need to find a solution for these export sectors. So one approach which the German government pursues in the framework of its G7 presidency is a climate club to complement the CBAM. The exact details of the climate club are not known. They are like the G7 presidency is like really still working on the details, because it's quite a complex endeavor to set up such an international climate club, and there remain many open questions. But the idea would be to have a climate club as a complement to CBAM, in order to, like in the mid to long term, create some sort of level playing field for all relevant sectors, including, of course, the exporting sectors. So, so the idea would be that this climate club would sort of be one like midterm solution to this carbon leakage problem of the exporting sectors, but of course, the climate club is not meant to replace CBAM, and it's and it will not solve the problem altogether. This is quite I guess all stakeholders and also the German government are aware of the challenges connected to setting up such a club, and even if such a club is implemented, everyone knows that there will be that a level playing field is not created from day one. But this is more or less the context and the approach the government is taking. Now I would come to my next slide and sort of the recommendations that we would have concerning the carbon border adjustment mechanism overall. So Agnese already mentioned the most important points, so I will be very brief. Of course, from a climate perspective, it's very urgent to have an ambitious phase-in of CBAM. What do I mean by ambitious? Ambitious for us means that CBAM is implemented quickly and has a as large as possible scope, which means we would recommend starting CBAM in 2026, not in 2027 or even later. To have a wide sectoral scope, which means at least covering the 5 sectors proposed by the Commission, plus the 3 additional sectors proposed by Mohamed Shaheen and the Parliament, hydrogen polymers and organic chemicals. And we would also support the compromise in the parliament to include all sectors by 2030. And yeah, reiterating what Agnese already said, like we also recommend a very fast phase-in of the CBAM, which means a fast phase-out of free allowances. Due to 3 reasons, which have also been already mentioned, but I think it's really key to understand the sort of 3 benefits of this fast phase-in, fast phase-out. First, of course, it's an incentive for European companies to accelerate industry transformation. We've talked about this before. Then second, and I think this point should not be neglected, the fast phase-in of CBAM would, of course, be an additional incentive for companies in trading partner countries to accelerate their industry transformation. Of course, like we always focus on achieving the European climate targets, but yeah, if we want to achieve the 1.5 or want to stay below the 1.5 degrees temperature rise, of course, we need to look at the global industry transformation. And the third point, which is really important, Agnese has also mentioned this before, if you have a faster phase-in of CBAM and the respective fast phase-out of free allocation, you will have a much higher revenues for targeted support. So when I talk to industry stakeholders, I always mention this point because they will always say, oh, there cannot be a phase out of free allocation because we need the money to invest in our transformation. We need the money for the necessary investments. But of course, you could use perhaps not the entirety, but a large part of the revenues, the additional revenues from auctioning the allowances to support, or target in a targeted manner, support the industry transformation, which means that, yeah, in my view, this argument is quite invalid because you would just have much more targeted support for industry, yeah, if you increase the revenues. Yeah, quickly to my last 2 points, which are on the same slide. Thanks. So we would also recommend not including export rebates in the CBAM, because export rebates would mean that the price signal for European companies which are exporting is sort of minimized. It's not. It wouldn't disappear completely, but it would be minimized to a significant degree. So the whole ETS sort of incentive would be reduced significantly. And of course, there's the problem that it's quite difficult to find a way to implement export rebates which is compatible with WTO, with the WTO. So from a climate perspective, and also from a perspective of pursuing a cooperative approach, which is not sort of in a confrontation with trading partner countries, we would strongly urge to do without export rebates. However, we also, because we are coming from a German perspective, we also see the need to have some form of carbon leakage protection for the exporting industry, because yeah, as yet we have not seen sort of proven carbon leakage, but we think that with higher prices the risk of carbon leakage would increase. So we do think that there should be some form of protection also for the exporting industry, and yeah, we just see the need for like developing new instruments, which which mean that we can achieve our climate targets and still prevent carbon leakage for the export industry. And my very last point is that if we have an ambitious phase-in of CBAM, that also means that trading partner countries would be affected by the CBAM earlier. So actually, like from the point of view of having a cooperative approach and a slower phase-in of CBAM would actually be more advantageous. But of course, this from a climate perspective, this is not what we want. That means we would really recommend an ambitious and fast phase-in of CBAM coupled with financial support for poorer trading partners. So the most important point, of course, is to use all CBAM revenues to support trading partner countries in their decarbonization efforts. But we would recommend even using additional funds to support poorer trading partner countries. For example, in the framework of bilateral climate partnerships, or like climate partnerships like the one which was established with South Africa and which will now be established with Senegal and other countries. So I think these 2 points are key to have a like ambitious phase-in of CBAM to achieve our climate targets, coupled with financial support for poorer trading partner countries in order to realize climate justice and not like in order not to achieve the European climate targets sort of on the back of poorer trading partners. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna, for presenting the German perspective on this. It's very interesting, of course, because Germany is one of the main dynamos of the EU economy. And also, it also highlights how these policy instruments will affect different countries in different ways. On the issue of export rebates, I guess, in my analysis of the situation, it could actually lead to potentially a perverse situation where there occurs sort of climate dumping or something similar, where stuff, if exporters get rebates for exporting, say, polluting stuff, then we may dump polluting products in poorer markets. For example, like, I don't know, internal combustion engines. If we allow them to continue to be produced and then you get an export rebate for them, for example. We've seen this in other policy areas, like with mercury, for example, that mercury bulbs are not allowed to be produced in EU anymore, but EU producers are allowed to export them. So yeah, there are risks involved in implementing things like an export rebate from the climate perspective and also from the social and economic and political perspective. But the support for poorer trading partners is an important issue. Of course, a lot of poorer trading partners aren't involved in the kind of trade we're talking about here, but there will be a knock-on effect. So that should definitely, as Anna points out, be studied, and we should find a way to help these poorer countries adjust to the problems raised by, or the challenges, I should say, raised by CBAM. Okay, I'll just, if you bear with me, I'm just gonna, in the slideshow, it's still on my screen here. And then we'll hand over to Domien, who will present his perspective from E3G on the REPowerEU policy instrument that's been proposed to deal with the challenges raised by the Ukraine war and the green transition and move away from Russian oil and so on, and gas, and how it affects and its relationship with ETS's Market Stability Reserve. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, and good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon, it's almost, yeah, it is already afternoon. Yeah, my name is Domien Vangenechten. I am a policy advisor at E3G, where I work on industry decarbonization, lead our work on the emissions trading revision and CBAM as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about a more niche topic, perhaps, but not less important, not at all, which is the Market Stability Reserve and its revision, which is also covered by the Parliament's vote this week, and how the Commission's plans around REPowerEU risk interfering with that revision and endangering it. Just quickly, for those of us or those of you not so familiar with the Market Stability Reserve, what is it? So the MSR was established in 2016 and began operating in 2019. Basically, it was presented as a structural answer, an automatic mechanism to deal with oversupply of allowances on the market. So in the late 2000s, early 2010s, the market, the ETS market was flooded by additional supply through international credits, an economic crisis, generous amounts of free allowances that created a huge structural surplus, which pressed down prices and which basically hindered an effective emissions trading system. So the MSR was introduced and acts as an automatic mechanism that gets triggered is if the oversupply is too high or the TNEC is too high. If it's above a certain threshold, MSR activates, it reduces the amount of auctioning that gets put on the market. So it reduces supply and puts that away in a reserve. That MSR accumulates allowances over time. And it was decided in 2018, it will invalidate any allowances above a certain threshold. So what we see over the last few years is that that MSR has been working in overdrive and in a matter of 4 years has accumulated about 2.5 gigatons of allowances that are put aside. At the same time, the surplus, the TNEC, has remained remarkably high at about 1.5 gigatons of allowances, showing that we still have that problem of an oversupplied market, and an MSR and a strengthened MSR should be quite welcomed. So what the Parliament is voting for this week, to start off maybe on a positive note, is actually an improvement from what the Commission has proposed in July last year. So the Parliament is proposing to maintain the intake rate of 24% for the rest of the decades, but is proposing especially to change the thresholds. So the upper thresholds would be lowered to 921 and 700. And on top of that, those thresholds will decline after, I believe, 2025, in line with how the cap is declining. And we have briefly calculated the impact of that, and it means that about 280 million additional allowances would be taken away from the market. And that is a welcome and necessary change. It might not go, as far as we would like it to go, but it definitely is an improvement to deal with a persistently high oversupply, persistently high TNEC, to deal with future surplus that will be generated by things like mandatory coal phase outs. Yes, in the short term, we might be refiring some coal power plants to deal with the current crisis we're in, but those coal phase outs will still happen this decade. And lastly, as the power sector is decarbonizing, the hedging needs of the power sector are also rapidly decreasing, and the threshold should be adjusted as such. So far the good news. In the meantime, the Commission has, in light of REPowerEU, made a sort of shocking proposal. It has announced its intention to generate 20 billion euros from auctioning allowances in the MSR. So to summarize what that is, we have a stability reserve that takes away allowances that are too much, that are not necessary, that are oversupplying the markets, that are basically representing hot air, the Commission is proposing to put those back in the market to finance REPowerEU measures, including, as cherry on top of the cake, including gas and oil infrastructure. So what are the possible consequences of this? There are, in our view, three consequences. On the one hand, more emission permits in circulation means, especially in the short term, additional emissions that can be released in the atmosphere, so bad for climate. Secondly, it will have an impact on prices. So on the top right graph, you can see that following the Commission's announcement on 18th of May, prices dropped by 10%, almost 15% in the following days, and have remained consistently below 90 euros since then. And analysts are also readjusting their carbon price forecasts for the coming years. So we will have lower prices because of higher supply in the short term. So what does it mean? Lower prices mean lower abatement incentives for covered installations. So again, potentially higher emissions, and also means lower revenues for member states and EU ETS funds, such as the Innovation Fund, such as the Modernization Fund. So even though the Commission is presenting this as additional revenues, it will basically eat away future revenues from member states and from EU ETS funds. Some analysts are even suggesting or analyzing that this might be potentially revenue negative, meaning that the loss in revenues in the coming decades might be more than the 20 billion that the Commission is proposing to raise. And thirdly, it is impacting the market functioning. So I think for those of us that have been active in ETS for the last few years, we've seen market confidence return, and we've seen a very well-functioning market in the last few years. And this sort of unwarranted intervention by the Commission basically undermines credibility. It is causing a lot of uncertainty among market participants. Will the Commission do this again? As I said in the beginning, it's a nice pot of 2.5 billion allowances that gets added to each year. You know, we don't know what happens in 2 years. The Commission might again try to find additional revenues for some new project in the future. So that raises a lot of issues. Some final remarks around this. And this loops back to what Agnese and Klaus and others have been saying in the beginning. We have seen a very small ambition increase from this Parliament vote, or the expected Parliament vote this week, and we risk seeing that nullified through this tampering with the MSR by the European Commission. So basically, the vote this week might already be outdated because this proposal that will be dealt with later this year might reverse the small increase in ambition that we might see from the Parliament this week. You know, we could raise the question, if money needs to be found to finance REPowerEU, which is logical. We need money to get away from gas and to rapidly reduce our reliance on Russian gas. You know, it should ideally not create additional supply to the markets, and it should truly be additional. So, you know, a potential revenue resource or revenue option to raise these revenues are the free allowances. These are, you know, a very big pot, about or close to 5 billion allowances this decade. Why not use a small percent, you know, 2, 3, 5% of these allowances to finance REPowerEU? This would not create additional supply. It would be truly additional, would also send a strong signal of solidarity by covered installations, you know, to get rid of Russian gas as fast as possible. And thirdly, and this links again to the Parliament's votes, you know, functioning of the carbon market shouldn't be further disrupted. And there are other amendments that the Parliament is proposing that might risk doing this. One example I've copied in here is the proposed changes to Article 19, where the Parliament says that only regulated entities with compliance obligations may hold allowances. This, you know, in essence means that any financial institutions financial institutions that don't have compliance obligations but are part of the market to provide liquidity, they provide good functioning of the market, might be excluded from participating in the market. You know, we think this is unnecessary. It also does not follow the recommendations from the report of the European Securities and Market Authority. and risks further, decreasing confidence of market participants in the market. So maybe 3 calls for actions for the Parliament is that, really vote for this strengthened MSR and even go beyond what you voted for 2 weeks ago. It is really necessary given the Commission's plans around MSR tampering. Secondly, reject the Commission's use of MSR allowances to finance REPowerEU and find alternative means. And thirdly, please don't undermine proper market functioning and market confidence, which we have built up again in the last few years. I'll stop here, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Domien. Thank you for that presentation on a little known aspect of the ETS, and it shows that what you give with what the right hand gives is often taken away by the left hand here. So yeah, it doesn't using like MSR revenues to finance the REPowerEU doesn't really make much logical sense. So let's hope that is shot down as a proposal. So thanks again for that. And now we'll move over and start, discussing some of the questions raised, the issues of concern that people are expressing. So maybe I'll start off with a general question to the panelists, and someone could come in and answer. So could you shed some more light on the political dynamics that have been going on in the background? How is it that we went from having a promising, not imperfect, but promising Environment Committee package to this, watered down, disappointing, dangerous package that we got at the wider plenary vote? Would someone like to tell us how that came about? Klaus.
Yes, thanks a lot for the question, and others, please feel free to compliment. I mean, this is really now a bit my assessment, but it was also, of course, when we looked at the kind of majorities that we had in the European climate law 2 years ago, we would expect that by now, the kind of climate crisis has even become worse. So there should be also kind of viable majorities in the European Parliament to pass increases of ambition, for example. But so why did it happen that it did falter in such a way? So we saw this, basically this compromise that we saw in the Environment Committee was kind of forged without the EPP, without the group of the rapporteur Peter Liese. So we had a majority there that was mainly carried by the Socialists, the Greens, and the Renew Europe group. And it was also a compromise that was first pitched by the Renew rapporteur Emma Wiesner. So it's also the kind of ambitious outcome came from within the Renew Europe group. But we immediately saw that after the Environment Committee, there was concern that it might be too ambitious for some of the parts also within the Renew Europe group in plenary to be supported, but also some concerns also from some national delegations within the SND. So there was immediately a process to work on a new compromise that would be would have a bit of a better backing in plenary. But here in this process, critically, we saw, that by some of the lead MEPs, in particular Pascal Canfin from the Renew Europe group, that too much was compromised too early. So the compromise that we actually then saw emerging from this process was not really on the spectrum between the Commission proposal and the very ambitious outcome of the ENVI, but it was actually just the Commission's proposal repackaged. So it was quite a very, very watered down outcome. And this, I think, then in turn didn't really convince the more progressive parts of the Renew Europe group and the Socialists to support it. So that led then to this kind of dramatic back and forth situation that we actually saw in plenary.
So how do we square this with Pascal Canfin's image, the projected image that he's a sort of champion of the environment and climate? Agnese, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, if I may, I wanted to also add another aspect to what Klaus rightly pointed to, is the fact that not only the internal dynamics of the parliament and the internal sort of fractures of the main groups like S&D, but there has also been, especially on the aspects that look at industrial emissions and industrial profits, there have been major and heavy industrial lobby that have put enormous pressure on a lot of members of the European Parliament with huge scaremongering and inflated numbers about job losses and carbon leakage and entire wiping out the entire export sector if CBAM is introduced without clauses to protect their experts, or if free allowances, free pollution permits are phased out too soon. And these, unfortunately, are all arguments that resonate with a lot of MEPs, because nobody wants to be the cause of even potential job losses, and of course, and nor should anyone, but there is always somehow forgotten the good side, the benefits that an industrial transition, a green transition can bring, including creating new jobs. And there is also evidence shared by, namely, the European Commission with impact assessments of estimates that of the potential negative impact and positive impact, and these should be looked at more in detail to provide evidence against these inflated numbers and scaremongering.
Thank you, Agnese, which actually raises an interesting question, what your comments there. What do you say to people who are worried about these things, who say that greater climate ambition will hurt, European industry, damage its international competitiveness, and sort of hurt the European way of life or something? What can we say to people who make these allegations and claims?
I'm very happy for my colleagues also to come in. We are faced with this question almost on a daily basis in our job, but I would say that first of all, we would need some evidence and some actual evidence of of this claim negative impacts, and also look, like I was saying, at all the benefits. And let's not forget that keeping the temperature rise below 1.5 can only have benefits. And all the negative impact that we are already feeling today can only get worse. So we should consider that. And I still don't fully understand myself sectors that are especially reliant on types of work, if you want to lack of better names, but like agriculture, for example, how they are not pushing for more climate ambition since they're relying such a sensitive sector to weather change.
Great, and that's an important point to bear in mind, that we should work on evidence, and as plenty of research has shown, there's very little evidence of actual carbon leakage happening. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. And and we need to adjust to a changing world. So if we don't adjust our economy and industry today, we'll be forced to do it at a much greater cost in the future. That is true. Thank you, Agnese. So there's, another question here.
I think Domien wanted to follow up on my comment.
Oh, you did? Oh, sorry, Domien, I didn't see you there. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No worries. I think Klaus also raised his hand, but I can go first.
Sorry, I missed that.
I think,
my apologies.
No worries, no worries. Just to compliment Agnese as well, I think, there's an age-old discussion between like ex-ante modeling proof of carbon leakage that can occur and the lack of ex-post proof of carbon leakage that has occurred. And it's always a sort of a chicken and an egg problem. I think beyond that discussion, there's also a question of how you address a potential risk of carbon leakage. And I think the default option so far is exemption. And that's not only free emission permits, that is also we're going to give you tax rebates, that is also we're going to exempt you from certain regulations, etc. And all these type of carbon leakage measures have basically obstructed, on the one hand, failed to apply polluter pays principle, on the other hand, obstructed effective decarbonization. So I think as a society, we have to move, if it is politically deemed difficult to decarbonize without providing some sort of protection against carbon leakage risks, that kind of carbon leakage protection needs to be in line with our climate goals, right? So we need to start thinking about, putting in place standards for low carbon products that will also act as a sort of border adjustment. We need to start looking at different types of support mechanisms that, actually incentivize emission reductions and don't just incentivize incumbent production, etc. I think we need a much more creative solution towards this perceived political problem, rather than just saying we'll give out free allocation at 100% and let's hope that money will be used to reinvest or will be invested in climate solutions.
Good point. Thank you for that. Indeed, yeah, because of course the evidence suggests the contrary. That the free permits haven't been leading to innovation and investment in the transition. So we need, indeed, like you say, creative solutions. That's a good point there. Klaus, do you want to add something here?
I think, yeah, you already mentioned everything very well. I mean, just to say, I also posted it in the box. Of course, we see also within industry quite a fragmentation, right? I mean, we have some industry players that actually have shown the way to make plans and also to really move ahead with moving towards climate neutral production, and they are at the moment really not benefiting from the system. So they are actually put at the competitive disadvantage by this very untargeted way of giving out free allowances to really big incumbents. So it's really the question also on how can we incentivize really those big industries to move, and yeah, kind of a lack of conditionality is certainly not the way. And in the bigger picture, of course, it's also always the question, how does Europe want to lead the way internationally? We have a COP in Egypt this year, and if already Europe is kind of faltering on its promise to really lead by example, lead by showing policies that are aligned with 1.5 that can show a success story here, this of course will also really backfire internationally and lead to further breaking of the process. So, yes.
Very true. Thank you, Klaus. To move on to another question, we've talked about the freebies, quite extensively. What are the consequences of these free pollution permits? We know there's no such thing as a free lunch. What are the consequences for the environment, the economy, and society? Does anyone have a view? Maybe Anna, do you have a view on this? Or
thank you so much. I'm also Agnese, I'm sure Agnese can complement. But there are several consequences. I think the most relevant is that the European companies and the industry sectors are still not going to receive sufficient incentive to really invest in the necessary transformation, and because of the very long life cycles of many production processes and or technologies. This is a big problem, because if you don't invest right now or change your production processes right now, you will have these technologies for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So if you miss the opportunity now, or maybe the opportunity within the next 10 years, there will be a lock in these fossil fuel intensive or energy intensive, carbon intensive production processes. So it's really a matter of starting the transformation right now and accelerating the transformation. And if the companies don't receive like the price signal, or if they have the feeling that they can rely on the governments and the European Commission to continue like just protecting them and protecting their old business model, and we will see, like, of course, big problems, and also in terms of not only in terms of achieving our 2030 climate targets, but also in terms of achieving climate neutrality. And we will, that's my last point, we will also face big problems in the future, because the green markets are the markets of the future. So this means like there are like knock-on effects in terms of employment, economy, and so on and so on. If like in, let's say, 10 or 20 years, like other parts of the world will have like decarbonized already, and green technologies are like, or like the markets of the future belong to the green technologies, and European companies are still polluting. So this will have like, of course, effects in terms of, as you mentioned before, health, employment, economy, society, and so on. Klaus, you want to comment?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Anna. Yeah, maybe also just to keep in mind, I mean, what is currently happening is there's also a social question about this. I mean, lack of contribution of this very highly polluting sector. I mean, we've seen that in the past, free allowances were given a bit as a, I mean, it was a temporary system to also make sure that industry is kind of preparing itself for the decarbonization. We now, Agnese has shown the data, and not really much has happened actually in the last decades. So this is now, we are entering a bit of phase where we're running out of time. We know that the European economy has to reach climate neutrality hopefully earlier than mid-century. So there's really a ticking timeline. And we see also that prices for this effort are already hitting low-income households. They are hitting society. And of course, the more protection we actually give to those high polluting sectors means that these costs that are still associated, of course, with the pollution and also with the transition are being shouldered by the rest of society. So there's also really a question about the social fairness, about the contribution of each sector and each member of the society towards the transformation. And the further we procrastinate really tackling the big pollution, the higher those costs will be for those that are already in vulnerable circumstances right now.
Very true. Yes, yes. Good points about the future, because we can see this issue in the present, like the crisis we're going through now is kind of a reflection of the lock-in we've already experienced with fossil fuels and our failure to, in recent years to accelerate the green transition. So we're paying the price already now. So further lock-in, I guess, will only, magnify that price. There are some other questions here, but did someone want to comment on this briefly, Agnese?
If I may, because we have no shortage of arguments against free pollution permits, as I showed in my presentation, there is also the fact that by continuing to give free allowances, so allowances free of charge, in a way, member states keep forgoing their auctioning revenues. And so we keep not having enough resources, enough funding for climate action. But what does it mean? It means that member states are now raising revenues that they can reinvest in energy efficiency measure, in renovation of buildings, in better road transport and low carbon or zero carbon mobility, and a better agriculture methods. And I mean, there is really no shortage of how of things that and actions that these revenues could be reinvested into, including, and that's what I wanted to make very clear, is we're not talking about taking sort of money away from industry without reinvesting in them, but we've always called for an increase of the innovation fund, for example, to support projects that are truly slashing emissions in carbon intensive sectors, and this is needed. And revenues from the phase-in that are freed up in a way that are generated by the phasing of CBAM and the phase out of free pollution permits are the ideal candidate to support projects funded by the Innovation Fund. But this still, I mean, doesn't happen. The more we sort of push further away in time the phase out of this pollution permits and keep sort of succumbing to industry's crazy claims.
Yes, very valid points about generating the resources for the green transition and investing in climate action. Very, very important points there. I think we have time for one more question, which we'll answer briefly. So there's a question here about, it's not entirely relevant to our current discussion, but it might be worth covering. We should also demand the inclusion of all sectors. This is a question. Should we demand the inclusion of all sectors into the ETS? That would make reforming the ETS more meaningful or mobilize more sectors and resources, according to this question from the audience. So should we include all sectors or more sectors? Is there a chance we'll see a more ambitious proposal at the Parliament vote tomorrow, possibly or not? Who would like to answer this? Klaus and Anna and everyone. Okay. All right. Keep it brief, please, because we only got a couple of minutes left.
Thanks. Yes, I can give it a go. Of course, this is also a very on-point question, as we have the discussion at the moment about the new ETS for road transport and buildings already being proposed by the European Commission. I mean, overall, we know that we have to have carbon pricing in all sectors ultimately. So the question is rather like, how do we get there? So as NGOs, we actually have listed a bit the safeguards, like how should this extension of carbon pricing go forward? But I think ultimately this is somehow where we have to get to. Pollution has to cost a price. We need to make sure that we recycle the revenues generated, but at the same time, and that I think is something that you probably associated with the NGO's reaction to the extension of the ETS, we also can't rely only on the market. And we have to make sure also that member states, that governments, the judiciary takes a responsibility in actually ensuring the urgent and immediate drive down of emission allowances. So we need kind of a combination of regulation and market instruments, and also strong levers to ensure that member states reach their own nationally binding targets as well.
Excellent point. Not by markets alone. Yes. Agnese, did you have something to say there?
Well, indeed, on the point on ETS2, as Carbon Market Watch, we're not against carbon pricing policies as long as they are like well designed and structured. But we can also take, for example, take a look at the extension to other sectors like the maritime sector and aviation, which are industries that should be covered by carbon price. And in fact, the proposal to include the shipping sector, the faster phase out of free allowances to aviation are good elements that should definitely be kept then eventually in the final text.
Great, thank you, Agnese. And Anna, you had a...
Yeah, just very quickly, thank you. I think the question related to the CBAM sectors, or to the sectors and included in the CBAM, where I said that we would support including all sectors by 2030, yeah, as I mentioned before, we think that a very large scope for CBAM is the best option. However, the reason why we don't support the immediate inclusion of all sectors is that they're just like quite complex value chains and complex monitoring processes involved, which makes including some sectors like in the chemical industry and other sectors very complicated, or there are still problems related to resource shuffling, which we want to prevent. So it makes sense to give some time to tackle these problems or find solutions for these challenges, and yeah, start with these 8 sectors in 2026, which already cover most most emissions where there is a carbon leakage risk.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, all right. Maybe if anyone has a final sort of very brief remark, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add? All right, excellent. I'd like to thank our speakers, Klaus, Agnese, Anna, and Domien, and to thank also the organizations involved in today's presentation. Of course, we at Carbon Market Watch, CAN Europe, E3G, and Germanwatch, and also for the support of the Live ETX project in preparing the material and the support for this press briefing and briefing for other stakeholders. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and for listening and participating and posing your questions. We really and truly hope that the European Parliament, will seize the final chance it has this week to get things right. Current and future generations, count on MEPs to vote with their conscience and to vote for the climate and for the future. Let's hope they seize this opportunity. Thank you all very much, and yeah, keep watching and pushing your MEPs. Thank you.